Thank you. So in preparing for today's keynote, we met a few times, and what I didn't know is that Lucy actually has her roots in adult education in New York City, and an adult ed program that she ran support services for students there and conducted parenting classes and anger management. And she works now in the northwest suburbs of Minneapolis, St. Paul, working with teenagers with IEPs, and she still very much gets adult education. And you can see from her bio on the screen that Lucy is a social worker and she is an expert in trauma-informed instruction. There is a long list of accolades and accomplishments that I could share, but I will let her say more about her work when she introduces herself. But I will just say this, Lucy's work is grounded in schools and in school culture. And it is also grounded in mental health and in wellness. Lucy's practice sits in the intersections of education and social work and how trauma affects teaching and learning. And I think it relates to each other, to us as we relate to each other as staff and as students, and really how we move through the world. And if you are one of those tech savvy folks and are game to try, like we did before, if you would give a little reaction button to welcome her, I would love that. So give some applause or a welcome Zoom style to Lucille Rosario, our keynote speaker this morning. Thank you so much and welcome. I love when people just type clap. Love it. That's great.
A note to Lucy, you'll have to unmute yourself. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to get to work with Atlas again. We today are going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to me, which is resilience and compassion fatigue and how we stay well while doing difficult work. I know I've had my challenges over the last 20 some odd years of being a social worker. And so I hope this you all will find very helpful. Before we get started with the content, though, I want everybody to just take a minute. It'll be a little less than a minute. You can breathe with the image on your screen or breathe at your own pace, but put away phones and emails and other things and just take a moment to get grounded and refocused in the space. Give your stress response system a little bit of a break before we get going. Great, thank you. So this is me, Patsy. Thank you for your introduction. I have, as you can see in the pictures, I have 2 kids and 2 fur babies who I adore and I'm hoping will not interrupt us during this keynote. They seem to be pretty calm. But I have my professional roots. I worked in Mexico for a while, and then I got my master's degree in social work in New York, and I lived and worked there in the Bronx for a number of years before moving back to Minneapolis. And I have worked, I started in kind of community development and adult education and moved into more clinical and trauma therapy work, particularly focused on interpersonal and gender-based violence. I've done some volunteer work also at the border with folks seeking asylum. And then I am now in K-12 education. I'm working on my doctorate degree where I'm really studying and learning more about the intersection of trauma and healing in an educational setting. And I'm currently the special services supervisor for the middle and high school at Brooklyn Center Schools. So we are going to get into a very quick but breakout group throughout this session that we have together. We are going to go back into these groups. So I want you just to get to know each other. You're going to say your name, where you work, your role, and then if your mood were the weather, what would it be? And then what I would be very curious for groups to report back through the chat when you come back, what are some things you're hoping to get out of this session? That way I can make sure that I try to hit on the different topics and what folks are interested in. So for example, me right now, I think I'm kind of like that sun peeking through the clouds because I was really tired when I woke up this morning, but I'm excited to be here and I've had some coffee and I'm kind of ready to go now. So if we can do the breakout groups, it'll be about 8 minutes.
All right, everyone. You'll be
Right. Welcome back, everybody. Before we move forward, I would just like to hear if there's anything that came up in the group that folks would like to make sure that we talk about today. You can either unmute or you can put that into the chat.
I thought it was really helpful to meet other teachers. It's one of the things, even when we're virtual, I like to see and meet other people that are doing kind of the same thing that I do. And I felt it was really refreshing and to have a workshop where we got in and just got to meet each other, you know, in a group before we even started. I appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I know when I go to conferences, that's always kind of the best thing, and it can be easy to forget, I think, sometimes in a virtual space. I'm glad you enjoyed that. In the chat, we are having a lot of kind of different ideas. People excited about learning how to avoid burnout, being able to establish boundaries. We will definitely talk about all of that. Somebody's interested in hearing about my experiences at the border. If we miraculously have time at the end, I would love to talk about it. But I go down right in Tijuana, where there's a lot of kind of makeshift shelters. I'm sure folks have heard about. Yeah, and it's really, I love going down there. And then there's also a couple about practical strategies for the classroom. And while this here that we're going to talk about today is really focused on educators and folks working in adult basic education and any sort of helping services about how to take care of yourself and the impact on you and on organizations. We're all human beings. So the way that stress and traumatic stress impacts students, it also impacts us. So as we talk through it, and I'll make some references to this as well, keep in mind that it's not a dramatic difference, right? And so the things that are good for you are also good for students as well. And I know we've done more specifically about students and learners, participants with Atlas before, and they have a lot of great resources. And so even if you want more, because we'll only touch on a little bit here, I know there's other great resources there as well. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about stress, trauma, and the brain. It's going to be kind of a quicker topic, but really important to understand how that works inside of us so that we are able to understand ourselves and what's going on with ourselves. Then we're going to talk about how traumatic stress can impact the organizational culture, as well as ourselves, and how we want to focus on building resiliency. So we'll start with just a kind of quick rundown of stress, trauma, and the brain. So stress is just something we all have. It is a bodily function. It is necessary for survival. So we've had it throughout the history of human beings. It is also what helps us rise to the challenge. It allows us to learn new information, to pull an all-nighter, to escape danger. So it's not good or bad. It's just a fact of life. But it can become a problem. And so when stress becomes a problem is once it gets longer and bigger and stronger than our protective factors allow. So up there at the top, you see positive stress, and that's when you have like a brief increase of your heart rate, of the stress hormone levels, but it is within your window of tolerance, which we'll talk about. It is something that you know will end, and it's not too much to overwhelm your protective factors. Tolerable stress is when it starts to get bigger, right? It might be more prolonged and last longer, but it is still buffered by supportive relationships and protective factors. So by like having the resources that you need, and you can kind of see that light at the end of the tunnel. Toxic stress happens, and when it is lasts long enough or is big enough, even if it's quick, that it overwhelms your system. And that's when it becomes toxic. And this is very individualized because we all have our own individual web of relationships, protective factors, history, mental health coming into it. So an example, and if you've heard me talk about this before, you've heard this example, but for me with COVID, when we first shut down, I was in tolerable stress. I was a social worker with very high needs students and families in crisis while distance learning with my own kids. And so it was extremely stressful, but neither me or their father lost income at the time. We were able to pay bills, groceries. I had internet access. I was able to do, virtual get-togethers with friends. There was no violence in the home. And so I was able, while it was not hard, I was able to deal with it. About a year in, when I was back at school and we were shutting down and going back, and it became really apparent to me that this COVID was going to be a part of life and having to manage it, there's this heaviness that took over. And that's really where I feel like it kind of moved into toxic, because it was like, oh my goodness, this is just life now. Now, it took me a little over a year to get there, but if I had any situation was different in my life, right? If I was struggling before it hit with my own mental health issues, if there was violence in my home, if I had lost income, if I couldn't feed my kids, if I didn't have the support system I had, it would have moved from tolerable to toxic anywhere from immediately to at any point during that year. So that's just an example of how it can be very individualized for different people. So we don't know where that line is for other people. And a lot of times we don't even know where that line is for ourselves. But how stress works, and this is really, this is the brain model developed by Dr. Bruce Perry. And it's important to understand how the brain works to understand how stress works. In the brain, it develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. It also becomes more complex as you go up. It also becomes more plastic, which means it's easier to change. So the cortex, that's where all the learning happens. That's what everybody in here is in the business of doing, is to alter the cortex. And that's the easiest part of the brain to change. That's how we learn things. However, all messages go up from the bottom up to the top. And at the bottom, you have your survival, fight, flight, freeze. You hear this as the reptilian brain. The midbrain is where you get coordination, movement, your basic physical needs. The limbic system is where emotions are, relationships. And then finally, it will reach the cortex, which is the smartest part of our brains, which is where we have self-control, empathy. That's where we learn literacy, critical thinking. That's where we can reason and rationalize. And so as I'm talking right now, I'm thinking about the brain with my cortex, but those messages have to go all the way down through the dumbest part of my brain, out, up through the dumbest part of your brain before it reaches the cortex. And this allows for a lot of opportunities for messages to get mixed up, right? So if we are very stressed out, if we are scared, if we are in danger, dysregulated in the brainstem, if we are hungry, if we haven't slept well, the midbrain, if we're feeling emotional or unsupported or like a lack of belonging, it can get impacted by the limbic system. So a lot of different opportunities. The other thing that happens is when stress or danger, when the body senses it, the first thing it signals is the brainstem. So oftentimes when we have a stress response, not oftentimes, always, it's the lower brain that is first detecting it and first responding to it. And then it's the emotional brain before the cortex really has any say in what's going. And that's why we can know something, like I can know I shouldn't be crabby when I'm hungry, but that's not going to change it, right? Because I'm hungry and my midbrain is much more closely linked to my limbic system than my cortex. So that's why it's important to understand, this is also why the stress response system impacts every system in our body, right? So if you think about a time of high stress, you might notice that through tension in your muscles, you might be more klutzy, you might lose coordination or balance, be more emotional, brain fog. There's all of these systems that get impacted from stress or when our body alerts for danger. So part of Dr. Bruce Perry's model is he talks about how our brain functioning is completely dependent on our state of stress. So that means our cognitive ability and the part of the brain that we're able to access depends on the level of stress escalation we are reaching. And that's why it is so important, both as professionals and educators, for ourselves as well as for our students, to understand that, because we do lose our ability to learn and take in new information. And so our capability is also fluid depending on this, just like our cognitive, and that impacts our cognitive ability, our emotional, social, motor, regulatory. So every single kind of system that we depend on is dependent on our stress escalation level. So here's kind of like an example. So depending on your state, calm, alert, alarm, fear, or terror, you access different parts of your brain. So this is basically that upside down triangle brain model that we looked at earlier, turned on its side. So when we are in a calm state, we're able to access our entire brain. We're able to have abstract thought. We can have long-term memory. We can reflect. Then as it goes up, when we're alert, it's more of a concrete thought. And this is actually where we can take in new information. So if you're teaching a new concept in a language course or a math concept that's on the GED, it's much easier to get frustrated because you have a little bit of stress escalation, but that little bit of stress, that bump of stress hormone, is allowing you to take in new information. So in a classroom, what you really want is a rhythm between an alert state and a calm state where it goes into long-term memory. But then as you continue to escalate, you get into a alarm system, you're just down in your limbic system. At this point, you need to be cared for emotionally. You need to have a relational connection. You're no longer in a learning state, right? So the importance, the priority, both for yourself as well as for supporting your student, becomes much more relational and understanding and emotional support. Then as fear happens, you move into the midbrain and the brainstem. And this is where you see people get agitated. Their knees might start moving. They might start tapping. They need to like move, right? That's that fight flight. So they need to walk, run. They need to do something. And you really need to minimize your words because they're not in the limbic, the relational brain, or the rational brain at this point. They're in their bodies. And at the most extreme is the terror space. And this is where you're just completely reflexive. There's no sense of time. You're oftentimes people will be frozen. They won't necessarily be able to move. So the threat really needs to be removed from them so that they're able to start to de-escalate and feel safe. So over the last 4 years, we have all really experienced a lot of stress and more than that as well. And so what I would like is for us, we're going to take 5 minutes right now. I'll set the timer. And during this time, I want you to think and reflect. You can write or you can just like think about it. How do you look in each of these stages? What does your body feel like? And then also, what do your students or colleagues look like in each of this? What clues you in that something might be off? Or I know for me, most of the students I work with, they come in an alarm or fear state. So they're not coming in calm, right? And so how do you know how they're walking into your space? And then back to you, what do you need at each of these stages? So I will set the timer. And again, you can write. I love to write in the journal. Otherwise, you can also just kind of think through this. Sorry about that alarm. I usually try to pause it before that. I hope that was helpful at all. I'm wondering if folks are comfortable, feel free to unmute or you can put in the chat if there's anything that like really popped up. One thing that I always think about when I'm reflecting on this is just the ways in which I notice it in my body before anything else. And to the point, like I can get migraines or headaches, tension in my shoulders. I also get fairly like snappy, or I can start to isolate once I'm more in that alarm, even fear state. I'm also, I know of myself, I tend to be a flight person. So I get myself really busy, or I kind of use escapism to avoid if I'm feeling a high amount of stress. So when it all goes down, oh, another thing is I will grind my teeth at night, which is not good at all, and wake up with a really tense jaw. So as you thought about this, was there anything that popped up that you would be open to sharing to the group? If not, that is okay as well.
One thing that I was noticing as I looked over the chart was that I think my thinking or my reactions become increasingly less flexible and more rigid as I move
Yeah.
down.
Yep, completely. And that is definitely like a survival, a safety thing too. We have some folks. Oh, go for it.
Hi, I think something that I noticed looking at this is after such high levels of stress for such an extended period of time, I think that like my kind of my reader is off, and where like maybe something causes an amount of stress that's like at the fear level, like my body reacts like almost at the terror level.
Yep. And we'll talk about that, because that as you go through, and this really impacts your students as well, as you go through challenging or high stress situations, those pathways in your brain get used. And so one thing that Dr. Bruce Perry says is you have a sensitized stress response system, right? And so it gets much easier to sense fear or to have that response. We in the chat, we have somebody talk about how Minnesotans and a lot of immigrant learners learn how to hide, which is very true. I think you'll notice as we talk about this, that there's still, no matter how much we try to hide, it still can come out and we can pick it up. But there is a tendency, not a tendency, but one result of a lot of stress and trauma, also just culturally in Minnesota, people can really detach from their bodies. And so oftentimes we'll see it in other people, or other people will see it in us before we even realize it. And so really working on the self-awareness is crucial for both instruction and just like functioning in the world. And yes, the body totally knows how to respond. Headaches, stomach aches, your GI tract is very sensitive to stress, muscle tension, migraines, clamping down, being in control. It's a complete safety response, and I can be the exact same way. And then, yeah, learning environments and what states are typically valued in education. Yeah, our natural, like the way our policies are with education isn't always the most supportive of this brain science. So it is something that we're constantly having to balance. All right, thank you all. There's a lot of really, somebody sent it to their teenagers, which as somebody who works in a high school, I think that could be very valuable. All right, so trauma, when we talk about trauma, it is just one extreme of the same stress response system. It is that extreme side of toxic stress. So it can be one event, it can be a series event, it can be a situation that it lasts long enough where it overwhelms those protective factors. And so whether it's a car accident or living in an unsafe environment for a long enough period of time, that no matter how many supportive people you have, it just doesn't buffer the impact of that any moments. But really what it is the traumatic event or experience is one that overwhelms your system, however that may look. Dr. Dan Siegel shared, kind of founded this concept of the window of tolerance. And so up above this window of tolerance is where we are in our hyperarousal or fight flight mode. And below is hypoarousal or your freeze faint. And so as long as our stress levels stay within this window of tolerance, we're functioning, right? It'll be tolerable or positive. We have highs, we have lows, but it's not overwhelming our system. And so this is something that we all have. It's not something that you can measure. It's something that we have based on who we are, our brain chemistry, our life experiences. So this, like a typical day, nothing traumatic, no toxic stress. This might be what it looks like. But then what happens with simple or single incident trauma, and this is what people really think about a lot when they think about trauma. So whether it's an assault, a natural disaster, a car accident, what happens is one incident happens that pushes you up out of your window of tolerance. And so kind of the steps to this would be, and I like to use an example of a plane because I love to travel, but I'm a nervous flyer. So if you're sitting on a plane and everything's fine, you're maybe a little bit on the higher side. That's me because I just get a little bit anxious. And then you hit turbulence. The first response is you're going to freeze and look around to take your cues from the people around us because we are historically, like, we're social people, right? And so I often will look at the flight attendants and try to judge, are they scared, right? And I know I'm not the only one who does this. And so that's your flock, is when you kind of look around. So you freeze, you flock. Then if the flight attendants look scared or whatever cue you are taking is like, oh, this is serious, your first impulse is to flee. Can I get out of here? Can I avoid it? In a plane, the answer is going to be no. There's nowhere to go. And then the next thing you're going to kind of like tick through is fight. Can I fight my way out of this? Again, with a plane, not going to happen. And so when you realize you can't flee to get rid of it, you can't fight, there's no way to avoid it, this is going to happen, you hit a fright. And that's when the brain realizes, okay, this is absolutely going to happen. And then it will plunge you down below your window of tolerance. And this is what I think one of the most miraculous things our brains do is it's like, if this is going to happen, I'm going to block this experience as much as possible and make it as tolerable as possible. And you go down to hypoarousal. And this is where you're going to see disassociation, out-of-body experiences, fainting, falling asleep. But your brain is just going to shut it down while you go through what happens. So that's simpler single incident. The other thing that happens is when you are just riding that line for long enough, you will have the same impact and can have the same symptoms as you do with just one single incident. And it can actually, from a therapeutic perspective, be harder because many of the people with complex chronic or developmental trauma, they maybe have never really felt safe. So you're trying to help somebody return to a state they've never experienced. And so this is like unstable housing. This is unstable food. This is living in a home where there's a lot of fighting, even if you're never actually the one who's being threatened. Living around neighborhood violence. Just, you can think of hundreds of situations, right? And what happens is the more you get pushed out of your window of tolerance, or the longer you ride that line, the smaller your window of tolerance is. And this is related to what was just spoken about earlier. You get a more sensitized stress response system. You are learning that the world's a more dangerous place, so it is much easier to be pushed out of your window of tolerance. So if you think about some of our like immigrants and refugees that are leaving war or gang violence and have gone through the experience of trying to come to this country, right, which is incredibly dangerous, it would be very normal for their window of tolerance to be very small, which means that a much smaller stressor is going to push them out of that window of tolerance because their brain is so accustomed to having to constantly be trying to survive. We also know that when you're living in an unstable or unsafe environment for long enough, you are at higher risk. So most of the people that we work with, and many of us even on this call, have not only had your complex or developmental trauma, but during the period of that time have also had multiple big T traumas as well. And so it really becomes much more chronic and much more complex. It's not easily one or the other. So with this, there's a lot of different types of trauma. You have your acute, which we talked about, and that most people think of. You have your chronic, which is prolonged family or community violence, chronic bullying, domestic abuse, forced displacement, family separation, thinking about stuff happening down at the border, war, torture. You have complex and developmental. So that's ACEs, which I know Atlas is doing a training on. That's witnessing domestic abuse. That's neglect, things that happen as we're growing up. And then we also have racial and historical or generational trauma. And so this is the trauma that's caused by systemic oppression, racism, discrimination. The other thing that we know is that the experience of trauma can impact our genes, and they've currently tracked it down 3 generations. And so that's fascinating as well. So it can impact a family and a community, both socially as well as physiologically. So the core experiences of trauma, and this is important to know both for ourselves as well as for our students, is disempowerment, helplessness, disconnection, repetition, or being stuck in the past, and a lack of choice. And this is important because if we don't want to re-traumatize, or we want to be well, or we want to support healing in our students, we want to give the opposite of these experiences. So allowing and fostering a sense of agency, a sense of empowerment, helping folks connect to each other, to themselves, being reminded and regrounded that we're here in the present and not in the past, allowing choice within limits. So folks aren't being forced to do anything. They feel like they have voice, are all very core experiences. And if you think about this organizationally and with wellness of staff, this is also very crucial for a healthy work environment for people who work there to feel a sense of empowerment, feeling valued, feeling like they have choices and voices in there, and feeling connected to their colleagues or students, the work and the mission. So this is our first activity in our breakout groups, like full on activity. We have a scenario and it's out of order. And so this is a stress event where the stress response system is activated in a classroom. What I want you to do is to go into your groups, and you're going to have a discussion. I'll share this to the groups, and you're going to have a discussion and try to put this in order. Right? What happens first, then second, then third, then fourth. And then when we come back, we'll go over it as a larger group. And remember, all of these steps will happen in a split second, right? And so it's kind of like the Matrix. You have to really slow it down. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some good discussion in your groups. We are going to go through, and I'm just going to say I've done this activity a lot. I don't think I've ever had somebody who's gotten it completely back in the right order. And the reason why it's so challenging is because all of this happens very, very quickly. So I'm wondering if anybody can tell me what is the first thing, what sets off this entire scenario. And you can put this in the chat, or you can unmute if you would like, whatever you prefer. Any guesses?
The student becomes agitated?
So yeah, you're interacting with a student, right? So you're interacting, they become agitated. That's kind of the trigger that sets off the entire thing. And so then what happens? This is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So the student becomes agitated and is accusing you of not helping them. And then what? So we have emotional brain senses a threat, potential threat. Yeah, that's I hear, but Rebecca just put in there the thinking brain checks things out first. Remember, that's that flock. So that one on the top is number 2. Thinking brain checks things out and confirms that that threat is real, right? And so once the thinking brain confirms that that threat is real, what happens? Yeah, your thinking brain goes offline. And then what happens? And somebody's brain goes offline daily. I feel you. So does mine. So what, your thinking brain goes offline, and then what happens?
You
Your
react?
emotional brain, right, senses a potential threat and it starts to react, sets off the alarm. And then what does it do? It initiates your fight, flight, freeze response. So that's when you go out of your window of tolerance, whether you're up or you go all the way down. This totally depends on your brain, how sensitized your stress response system is, how you respond, if you're more of hyperarousal, hypoarousal. And so you initiate that. And then what happens? You react, exactly. So you react by raising your voice and telling the student they need to leave the classroom. And then what happens? Right? You get that release and you start to calm down. Your thinking brain comes online to help you calm down. Right? And then this is, for me, this is when I have the moment where I'm like, oh man, I could have handled that totally better. That was a mistake, right? And maybe I have to go apologize or repair or figure out what's next. And so this is an example in a classroom, right? But this also happens, any parents out there, I know this happens with me with my kids, right? Or in an argument with a partner, right? When your thinking brain goes off, you say something and then you calm down and you're like, oof, I really could have handled that so much better. With a coworker, just kind of across the board, this impacts everything. So because of that, this can impact an entire organization. And part of that is because we all operate within our organizational culture. And that's that shared set of values, beliefs, assumptions at our school, organization, and that all of us impact that school culture. So it can be impacted both by the history and the mission and the founding of that organization. It also is impacted by who works there and who comes in contact with it, the political landscape and social landscape that it's in, as well as the students and participants that access that. And it is hugely influenced by an organization's view of itself. So it's internal landscape as well as external landscape. So when I worked at Domestic Abuse Project, we were grounded, we were founded out of the women's movement and grassroots, and this kind of like small radical organization was really a huge piece of the culture. And this, like, we never quite have enough and we're always trying to scrape by. And we really hung on to that identity, even though the organization had been around for 30 years, we still felt like this new kind of startup and, trying to like change the world value in it. The other thing with culture is that it is always changing. However, it's also resistant to change. So when your culture is in kind of a more negative space, a high stress space, it can be very hard to try to get it back on track, but it's always going to change. And many organizational cultures and the level of stress in that culture can happen on a pattern. So like in Minnesota, for instance, it is very normal for organizations to be in high stress or be really hard right around this time, February. It's been a long time since we've spent a lot of time in the sun and the warmth. People start to isolate. It can also be impacted by what's going on in the world, right? So like the war that's happening in Gaza can very much impact what's happening in your classroom right now, or what's happening down at the border, or the elections that are going to come up. All of these things have an impact of what's happening in the classroom, in the organization, and can impact the organizational culture. And organizations and groups are just as susceptible to stress and trauma as families and individuals are, because they're made up of people. And what happens is this idea of parallel process. So what happens between a client and a worker, or an educator and a student, can be reflected in what that worker or educator, how they're interacting with their supervisor, which can impact how that supervisor is impacting with theirs all the way up an organization. And then how somebody is leading an organization can be paralleled all the way down to the students. And this is why when we talk about trauma-informed practices, and there's focus is always so much in the classroom, And it can sometimes give leadership, like, well, that's not my problem. That's like classroom instructional practice. But the fact is the entire organization needs to reflect that. It can't only be happening in the classroom. And more so, what's happening in the larger society can be paralleled all the way down to the classroom and vice versa. So one thing that happened at DAP all the time is because we had a survivors program, a perpetrators program, and a children's program. And with parallel process, what would happen is that the therapists in the survivors program and the perpetrators program would get into conflict, and the children's program would feel stuck in the middle. So it became very important for myself as the person who led the survivors program to collaborate and communicate and constantly be nipping these issues in the bud with the person who is leading the perpetrators program, because otherwise the entire organization would just kind of fall apart. So as students are coming in feeling unsafe, often that gets paralleled, and staff come in and feel unsafe, you end up with an organization that does not feel safe, and vice versa. Similarly with depression, right? You can see that down at the bottom. If students are feeling depressed, oftentimes staff can feel demoralized and the organization can feel directionless. Sorry. So it gets paralleled all the way up and all the way down. So when we're thinking about an unhealthy time, right, like which can be February sometimes, it is really important to, one, recognize that it's kind of like the waves, right? It's going to come in, it's going to come out, and it will change on its own. So it isn't necessarily a forever thing, but it's also very hard to intentionally change, but can be very important. So if there's a sense of staff are feeling demoralized and students are depressed, then it might help as a leader in an organization to really focus, okay, what is the direction? What is our mission? Let's reground, let's build up. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? Similarly, if everything's feeling overwhelmed and fragmented, as an organization, really focusing on how are we going to organize this? How are we going to connect? How are we going to build relationships? Just pause and take a moment. And so it's important to think about the entire organization and how that impacts down to the individual. Another thing that happens in high stress and traumatic stress is a reenactment triangle. When folks have gone through things, we are in a high stress state, we tend to reenact traumatic or toxic relationships. So this is Cartman's triangle. And you can be in each of these roles all in a matter of like a minute, or you can be very regularly put into one of these roles. But you know that you are being put into that rescuer position when you're feeling pressure or a pull to fix things for somebody else. It's like, save me, help me. The persecutor position role is when no matter what you say, somebody is taking offense and getting defensive, you are being seen as a persecutor. There's like no winning. And then when we're in the victim role, when we're feeling disempowered, we're feeling hopeless, we don't feel like we have any sense of agency or ability to control, we're feeling like harmed and kind of stuck, that's that victim role. And so this can happen in the classroom. This can happen between coworkers. This can happen between supervisors and staff. And an entire organization can be whipping around this triangle if we don't try to take a moment, pause, and adjust the cycle that we're stuck in. So the healthy triangle, what we want to try to move to is if we are in a victim role, if we're feeling very disempowered, and this can very often happen this time of year, is we want to think about, okay, what is it within my locus of control? What can I impact? How can I adapt? And some of that is like might be to choose to leave, but it could also be like, all right, my classroom, I can really focus on that. This change in policy, what can I do? How can I make this work for me? How can I have conversations and advocate for change? Like, what is within my control? What can I adapt to? If you're being pulled in to rescue, you want to really step back and try to support. So like, no, I can't do this for you, but I'll sit here while you make that phone call, or I'll teach you the skills, right? But not be pulled into that rescuer, whether it's for coworkers, for students, for anybody. Try to really focus on supporting. And then if you're in that persecutor role, you need to give space. The more you try to convince somebody you're not trying to hurt them, the more they're going to feel attacked. You get really, really stuck. One time, and then I've used this example a number of times, so if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard this, but a really good example of this for me was when I was working in an elementary school, and there's a second grader who had disclosed to me that she was being sexually abused by her mom's boyfriend for a couple of years. And so the boyfriend got arrested, and, you know, she was safe, but she disclosed that at school, and she was just whipping around this triangle. She would tear up rooms. She was in a state of crisis. And because we had a good relationship, I would always be called to intervene when she was struggling. And one time I was intervening, and she was completely out of her body and was yelling and like hitting and all this stuff. And I realized she was no longer seeing me. She was seeing her perpetrator, and that I was very much in this persecuted, because she had no choice about when she saw me or not, because I was just called in whether she wanted to see me or not. I was being forced on her. So I had to talk to the other support team and say, I need to take a break from responding, and she needs to be able to choose when she sees me and doesn't. We talked to her, told her what was going to happen, and I took a break, and it took about like a week and a half or so. And all of a sudden she was showing up at my door again, and we were able to like rebuild our relationship. But I really had to remove myself from being like forced on her. So that's kind of an extreme example, but it's something to just pay attention to. So with reenactments, one thing that we need to do is we need to just accept that this is going to happen. This is very normal. It's nobody's fault. We don't assign blame. It happens. We do it. Other people do it. It's what happens. Then we want to stop. If we notice, we're like, okay, this is not working. We might not even realize it's the triangle yet, but we're like, this is not productive communication. Just take a step back and slow down. See if you can say, can we come back to this later? I just want to think about it for a moment. Like, completely take a step back. And then it's very helpful to consult. Oftentimes when communication is completely broken down, you're usually in this triangle. And sometimes it takes a while when you're in it to realize what's happening. So talking to a colleague and really trying to understand what's happening, and then being able to reflect, name what's going on, and come up with, how am I going to reapproach this? Do I need to give space? Do I need to offer to support rather than to fix for them, right? Like, what do I need to do? It's also important to know that you might be in multiple roles in the same conversation, right? Somebody might come in and ask you to do something for them. You say no, then they get angry, and then you get moved into that victim role, and they're the like persecutor role. And then they feel bad, and then they maybe start crying, they're feeling guilty, and they feel like you made them feel bad. And then you're in the persecutor role because you weren't helping them, and they're in the victim role. So you're not always just in one of these roles, but some of us have a tendency to get sucked into one or easier than other ones. And a lot of folks, a lot of educators, social workers, nurses, we all tend to get sucked into that rescuer role pretty easy, because we generally want to fix things and to help. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the importance of co-regulation. And some of this parallel process co-regulation, this all works because of our mirror neurons. Our nervous systems interact with each other. And co-regulation is often talked about with early childhood, but it's just as important as an adult. And because our brain changes through experiences. So if we really want to learn how to calm and how to regulate, and we want to help people feel safe, they need to have that experience. And one way we can support that is by modeling and by co-regulating. And because then we share our calm rather than join the chaos. And that creates caring relationships and a sense of safety. And our brain is much more receptive. Talking about it is one thing that doesn't necessarily help, but actually experiencing it is where that learning and that change and the brain starts to change due to those experiences. So people learn to self-regulate by first co-regulating with other trusted people. And many times we hope this happens in childhood, but that's not always able to happen in childhood. It really depends on what folks are going through. Another note that was brought to my attention while everybody was in breakout groups is ACEs. There's a few different meanings, and there's ACEs in adult basic ed, but there's also adverse childhood experiences. And if you haven't, if you're not super familiar with it, the trauma groups that are going to start up, they're going to talk about it, I've been told. You can also look it up, but it's a huge study that talks about the impact of childhood experiences on health indicators across the lifespan. So I highly suggest, if you're not familiar with it, to look it up, and specifically to look up the Philadelphia ACEs study, which doesn't get enough attention. All right, we are going to take a 15-minute break right now. All right, welcome back. Hope everybody's making it back from your break and you're able to relax, kind of reset for a minute, because we are going to start talking about traumatic stress and us as the folks working in the field. So first off, sometimes it's a hard sell for why educators and social workers and everybody should focus on themselves and not just toughen up and focus on the students. I think historically, especially in the West, definitely in the Midwest, we have really set kind of a expectation that good work ethic means you don't need to worry about this. It shouldn't impact you. If you're tough enough to do the work shouldn't impact you this way. And you are selfish if you're not only looking at the students. However, what we know now is that you need to address compassion fatigue in order to create a positive culture. It also lowers turnover and staff absenteeism. And so there's a financial benefit for organizations as well. You also can't help students regulate and create an effective learning environment if you yourself are not regulated. So we have that option. This is that co-regulation of sharing our crazy or our calm. And so when you walk in, because of mirror neurons, right, you're going to set the tone for the room, and they are going to escalate to meet you, but you're not going to be able to help regulate them and help so they're able to access their brain and be able to learn. So taking care of yourself actually improves outcomes in the long run. So you can't have student wellness if you don't have staff wellness. And ultimately, if you're up here, you can't support or teach students down here. They're going to come up to meet you. So there's a lot, people use all these different terms interchangeably about traumatic stress and helping professionals. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that you will not suffer traumatic stress in the workplace if you are indifferent. So it stems from empathic engagement with learners and families. Basically, it stems from doing your job well. It is hard to be particularly helpful if you are completely indifferent to the people. And generally speaking, people in helping professions are not indifferent. There's a reason why we're here. So it's important to understand this and to use the terms correctly and to be able to seek support. So traumatic stress is an occupational hazard in the helping professions. It is not a weakness. It just means you're human and that you care. And it's going to happen. It impacts all of us at some point. One of the ways to know the terms correctly is to think of compassion fatigue as the umbrella term. And under it, we're going to talk about 4 different types of compassion fatigue. And the one that you hear about the most is burnout. And burnout is quite often used for everything, but it is its own specific type of compassion fatigue, and it is exhaustion. It is depersonalization. It is reduced sense of personal accomplishment. You are completely exhausted. You don't need any trauma exposure to suffer from burnout. You can be an accountant and suffer from burnout. It means you need to balance your workload a little bit. You might need to talk to your supervisor. And you are suffering from burnout when you have physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. You are at high risk of becoming over-involved with students and clients, of setting poor boundaries. You'll have emotional distress because of your exhaustion. Remember how the brain is structured? And this puts everybody at risk of exploitation of students because you don't have those healthy boundaries. The next type is secondary traumatic stress, or STS. And this is the emotional duress that results when you hear about a firsthand trauma experience of another person. So this is sort of the PTSD of helping professionals. It has the same symptoms as PTSD. It's very acute, it's very intense. You need trauma exposure. So one of my worst cases of secondary traumatic stress was when I was working as a trauma therapist, doing narrative exposure therapy with a woman I'd worked with for a long time. And we were talking through her first sexual assault experience as a child. And for days afterwards, I was having nightmares. It would come in and intrude in my thoughts. It impacted me physically. I was having a hard time listening and focusing on others. And I needed to go see my therapist, and we talked about it and we processed through it. And I needed to do that so that I was able to continue to support this client and not make her experience all about me, right? And so this is acute, and you often need to seek some sort of treatment, whether that is therapy, whether it's some sort of cultural or other healing practice, but to work through it so that you are able to heal and grow and learn and continue to do the work that you are doing. The next type is vicarious trauma, or VT. And this also requires some sort of trauma exposure. And this is the transformation that happens after a long period of empathic engagement with traumatized students and clients. This is like the slow buildup after just exposure after exposure after exposure, even if you're not told about it directly, but it starts to disrupt meaning and hope. This happens much more than secondary traumatic stress. You don't need to be listening or seeing or witnessing somebody else's traumatic event, but it's just when you hear about bad things over and over and over again, or you're around people who've been through really hard things over and over again, it's hard to maintain that sense of hope, and that sense of like a greater purpose, right? And it can impact all the way down to your own spirituality and meaning making. And it can impact your sense of safety of others, of the world, trust, your esteem, your intimacy, your sense of control. And for me, this happens to me probably every couple of years. It used to happen more than that when I was in more direct practice work. And for me, it really would feel like these storm clouds moving in. And it would feel like, what is the point? It's all terrible. Everybody's hurting each other. And it was very easy to kind of spiral and disrupt that spirituality, that sense of meaning, and sense of purpose. This is kind of like your complex trauma of the helping professions versus your single incident, which would be secondary traumatic stress. Then the fourth one is moral injury. And this is not, you don't necessarily need trauma exposure for this. And this happens when you are witnessing or are part of a system or organization that is acting opposite of your values, that's transgressing against your values and your deeply held beliefs. And it creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. So this can happen a lot. A good example is folks working in the child protection system, that you go into it, you're wanting to help families stay together and like a safe home for children, right? And then oftentimes you see over and over again this system that you are a part of causing more harm, and you feel a sense of inner conflict. This also happens in corrections, it happens in education, it happens kind of all over the place. And you can feel very powerless. You can feel like guilty by association. And some of the things that protect you from this is a belief in a just world, and then also being able to forgive yourself and to forgive other people, knowing that you're doing the best that you can do. So in summary, I like to have all of these kind of together because they're all really important. They're all very different, and you can have more than one happening at the same time. right? You can have vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress happening at the same time. I see often vicarious trauma and moral injury happening at the same time, and burnout can happen during all of them. So it's not always nice and easy. They also need different things in order to treat them. So burnout and moral injury, you do not need any trauma exposure. Anybody can experience these. You don't need to be around folks who've been through toxic stress or trauma to experience these. Secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, you do need that exposure. Otherwise, it's not one of those two. And then the core features are all different. So you have exhaustion for burnout, you have inner conflict and dissonance. In moral injury, you have the symptoms of PTSD, so nightmares, intrusive thoughts, irritability, a hard time focusing, the secondary traumatic stress, and a change or a breakdown of your core values, beliefs, outlook, worldview is part of vicarious trauma. And then the interventions are all very different. So with burnout, it's more about workload management. Maybe you need a vacation, maybe you need to talk to your supervisor, you need to kind of figure out what you're going to do. Secondary traumatic stress, you often need some sort of mental health intervention or other sort of healing practices, treatment, depending on what your practice is. Moral injury and vicarious trauma are more similar. So for moral injury, you need to think about meaning making. Why is it that you're doing this work or you are part of this system? Like, what is the reason you get up and you do this every day? And then once you know that, then you need to forgive yourself that you can't magically change all systems all at once. And that will allow you to be able to continue the work and to continue to do what you do value. Similarly, with vicarious trauma, meaning making is really important. When you're experiencing vicarious trauma, it's easy to lose sight of why you're doing it and what the point is. There's a lot of hopelessness. And so thinking, okay, why am I doing this work? What are successes I've seen? What are changes I've seen? And really grounding in that. Also tangible acts of care. So having that community and having that connection is super important. One theory we talk about a lot in social work is systems theory. And an individual can be a system, a group, an organization. All these are different systems. And when a system is unhealthy, we tend to like shut down and isolate and stop taking in feedback. So in an unhealthy organization, when different departments are in conflict or not talking to each other, or somebody's like, I'm just going to focus on what I'm doing and I'm not even going to worry about them. And there's very little interaction with each other, that you're generally in an unhealthy state. And one of the best ways to counteract it is to build up that sense of relationship, care, connection. This also helps build up resiliency, which we're going to talk about. And so it's important to keep those things in mind as we continue to move through.
Lucille, there was one question about what do you mean by exposure to imagery?
So exposure to imagery with a secondary traumatic stress. So if you see something, right, you can see something online, you can see images. Images are really powerful, images and smells, anything sensory related. So I mean, all of you are working in adult education. So even like some of the images that are coming back from the scenes that are happening in Gaza or Ukraine can be incredibly triggering, especially to the people that we work with who've gone through similar experiences. So our own vulnerabilities with secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma are also very much related on our own personal experiences as well, right? Because we come into this profession with our own life experience, our own traumatic experiences, like we are human beings as well, taking in this. And so you can be more vulnerable if it's triggering something from your own experience. And that's just part of being human. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Christine can lead our activity.
Okay, we are going to do a Menti activity. And if you have not done a Menti activity before, The easiest way to do it is on your phone. If you look in the chat box, Gail was kind enough to put the www.menti.com link, and then there's a code there, 74282620. And you will also see it here. You'll also see it at the top of the screen here. So the prompt is, as you see, think of yourself when you are at your professional worst or exhausted, write 5 adjectives that describe you. And we are going to get a word cloud out of this. And then Lucille, when you're ready to move to the second question, when you've seen this word cloud, just let me know.
That sounds good. So just think the first 5 adjectives that describe you when you are struggling your most at work. Like if I were to walk in, how could I tell you were struggling? Frazzled. I definitely get frazzled. Crabby. Short-tempered, interrupting, motivated. Eyes aren't sparkling. Yeah, it can really impact everything. Quiet, tense, angry, short, frustrated. Sarcastic. I'm also sarcastic at my best. I think it's part of my charm, but I think I execute worse when I'm not doing very well. Drawn, apathetic. Like, these are really good. So if you, as you're reading these, as they're popping up on the screen, let's think about what we've talked about with hyperarousal and hypoarousal, right? So fight, flight, a lot of that short, impatient, that high stress, not being able to be particularly creative, being easily distracted. All of this is part of hyperarousal. And the hypoarousal is shut down, quiet, isolated, depressed, weary, overwhelmed, exhausted. All that's hypoarousal. So every word I've seen pop up here so far is an example of hyper or hypo. It's both out of our window of tolerance. And snappy. So you see, as this is going, I would love for folks to put, you can either unmute or put in the chat. When you're looking at this, let's say you walk into an organization that is at its worst. If I walk in, what would be my experience? How would that feel? Would I be like, oh, this is great. I feel super relaxed.
Unwelcomed.
You could feel pretty cold, right? Tense, I see. A sense of defeated or confused. What?
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable.
Something's
No
off.
way.
Yeah, not noticed, right? It's very easy. This is also oftentimes like, you know, you walk down the hall, you pass somebody, you say hi, they don't say hi back, and you're like, oh, they're mad at me, right? Like very easy, like little conflicts when somebody is probably caught up in their own thoughts. Look at these words, right? And maybe doesn't notice. Yeah, you might not feel safe. So it is very easy to see from this how this can really this can be contagious, right? So if we're all kind of at a vulnerability, if it's dark and it's February and it's Minnesota, or there's a lot going on, or there's a lot coming into the organization from students, how easy it is to slip in to this. And then it kind of reinforces itself, right? That's that culture that while it changes, it's hard to change because there's a contagion effect. So yeah, insecure. So this is very normal at this time. Do you think people are like socializing and enjoying each other's company at this point? Probably not, right? Folks also probably don't feel particularly appreciated, right? We said not seen is one of the things that happens. So Think about this and think about your organization. Guarded and suspicious, 100%. All right, Christine, let's do the next one. So now moving to something more positive. Think about you when you're at your like professional best, right? When you're just rocking it. Everything is fantastic. You're like, things are great. And let's think of the first 5 adjectives that come to you and put them in the Menti. See, already I can actually feel in my body, my stress is relaxing reading these words versus the words before. That's how sensitive we are. We have motivated, we have happy, creative, productive, confident, collaborative, helpful, energized, focused, excited. Encouragement, cheerful, compassionate, positive. So now imagine me or yourself walking into this organization as these words start coming up. How would that feel? Yeah, proud to be part of the organization. Would you be able to tell that that's in a happy space? Yeah, you'd feel very welcomed. A sense of belonging, of inviting. People are like chatting. You could feel very motivated, want to be part of it. Do you think in this organization are people talking to each other, maybe socializing, taking feedback from each other? Probably, because we have a lot of things like collaboration and engage, right? This is when people, that system is more open and it's taking in information from other people. Are you more likely to be happy working in this environment or sad? Probably more likely to be happy. There's going to be a lot of energy. These are all really, really energetic, positive words that are up there. And this is just an example of how we reinforce it, right? And so when we get stuck in kind of that negative, unhealthy place, which is normal, right? This is not pathologizing any organization. That is going to happen. We sometimes need to like slow it down because we get caught in the cycle, right? And we may need to take intentional steps to try to connect, to foster happiness, to build relationships, to reground in why we're doing this work, to appreciate each other very intentionally, to try to change that cycle that the organization is caught in. You can also understand how, like if anybody's had one of those classes where things are going great and people are learning and are excited, you leave feeling a lot of this, and that can be contagious, right? And so you can kind of see how parallel process can really work, right? And that if you're feeling defeated in class, if it's really struggling, your students are struggling, because that's also going to happen sometimes, how do you take care of yourself so that you're able to reground and to connect rather than to isolate and to kind of spiral? So those are just some things to think about. Thank you for participating in this. All right, and I will go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So the other key piece that you saw in that second word cloud is this idea of compassion satisfaction. That's the opposite of compassion fatigue. So what you want to do is to foster the sense of fulfillment that we get when we're doing our work really well. And so a lot of people are motivated by the sense of satisfaction, and And it also results, and it's the reason why we do this really hard work, and it helps sustain us. But it is also possible to be experiencing both compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue at the same time. Everything, it's not a binary one or the other. It's, we're complicated people. We can have all of these feelings at the same time. So we're going to move in to talk about resiliency. If anybody has like a question or two really quick, we could do that very quickly. All right. So what we know, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is this, is self-care kind of like gets to me because it can feel very blaming on people. And it's also not totally realistic all the time. Me going to like a 1-hour yoga class or taking a bubble bath is not going to make me forget about the childhood sexual abuse story I had heard or what had happened in class that day, right? Like that's just not how it happens. It can be part of it, but it isn't a magic fix. And so what we really want to think about is we want to think about sustainable work practices, right? And think of ourselves as a complex person, right? And how are we going to nurture ourselves on all of these different levels? And some of the things that really has to come from the organization and from leadership. There's also things within our control. Remember, moving from that victim role to like, how am I going to adapt and make this work for me? But we first need to just accept that this is going to happen and it's a workplace hazard. And how are we going to build up our resilience so that we're able to bounce back and face hard things and celebrate the fact that we can bounce back from hard things? One key thing in all organizations is to really think about supervision and staff support. You want to have clear roles and expectations and communication as much as possible. You want to make sure you're helping people feel valued. There's this growth mindset. There's this hope for the future. People have a voice. This is also all the same for our students as well. If you're thinking about your classroom, having regular coaching or supervision sessions where there's a reflective model, that means where people can bring in what's going on. And the supervisor's role is to support and ask questions and to help people come up with their own solutions rather than just being administrative and task oriented. Making sure people have the opportunity to be trained. That training is a great way to like reset and feel motivated and feel less stuck. And then how are their consultations? How is peer support being fostered? And do staff have access to mental health support if they need it? Do they have vacation time? Is it supported for them to take care of themselves? What are the expectations of work outside of work hours? And how are people being supported and also being able to balance and take care of themselves as well? We need what learners need. So everything we are talking about is also what your students need as well, because we all have the same stress response systems. We've just gone through different experiences. So what creates resiliency is a lot of things, and some of it we don't have control over. Genetics, some experiences we don't have control over, supports. But another thing that can really create resiliency is having predictable, moderate, and controlled stressful experiences, like dosing it in. And that allows us to have the experience of facing a hard situation and being able to overcome it with the right supports, and it helps to rewire our brain. Vulnerability happens when stress is unpredictable, it's severe, and it's prolonged. So this is something that came from Bruce Perry. He developed this during the pandemic of an example of how we can build up resiliency during lockdown versus vulnerability. And I think these are a lot of really good examples of what we can enact in our own lives. And so it's not just about like 1 hour once a week, but how is our day structured? How are we having meals, building relationships? Healing happens through relationships. Are we being mindful of media and what we're consuming and how it impacts us? How about exercise, helping others, sleeping? What are our goals? And how are we looking at the future, right? How are we staying positive about that versus negative rumination? All of that builds up our resiliency. And one thing that we all need, and particularly folks who've been through toxic stress and trauma, is we need high structure and high warmth. And this is both in your classrooms, but also in your life and in organizations. So how are decisions and policies being made? Are they transparent? Do people have a voice in them? Is it clear? Is there a sense of predictability? Do people know what to expect? Is there boundaries at work? How does the organization foster interpersonal connections and friendships? How is warmth expressed, love and belonging? You can move this into your classroom as well. If you have high structure and no warmth, it's punitive, which is re-traumatizing. And what a lot of people think is being trauma-informed is high warmth and no structure. However, that's incredibly unpredictable. And if you don't have either, it's neglectful. So you need that high structure and high warmth. You also need to think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Learning and teaching and being successful in your job, that happens with esteem and self-actualization. That's up at the top of the triangle. So how are those bottom needs being taken care of? How are they being prioritized by the organization? How are you looking at them for you yourself? What are the resources or connections that are available for your physiological needs, making sure you have food and water, warmth, rest, your safety needs, your sense of love and belonging. And that's both for us as people who work in an organization, but also for an organization. If you have a staff member who's struggling, what are the resources that they can be connected to? Because we don't leave everything at the door. It comes in with us. And this is a way to show care as well. And then the sequence of engagement, and this is also taken from Dr. Bruce Perry. So often you go into like an elementary school and you see a kid struggling, you will often see an adult trying to reason with them, and they have no access to their cortex. And so what you'll see is you'll see them getting angrier and angrier and more frustrated and more dysregulated. So what we need when you think about that state dependence is we need to start by regulating that brainstem and midbrain. And then after that, we can relate to the limbic system, and then we can teach and reason and talk. So if somebody is struggling in class, you need to first give them a chance to calm down and get into their limbic system. And you can use co-regulation, you can use rhythm, walking, music, breathing, and then you can relate and connect, ask what's wrong, what's going on, right? I like to think of HALT-BO. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, overwhelmed. And this is also for you yourself and for your coworkers. What's going on? Are you overwhelmed? Are you lonely? Are you tired? What's happening? And then once somebody feels connected to and seen and supported, you can move into reason. Okay, what's the plan? How are we going to fix this? But if you jump too quickly to reason, it's not going to work. If you yourself are in a fear state and you're trying to reason and operate with your cortex, you're going to have very little success and feel pretty out of control in your response. Katrina, do you have a question?
Could you just repeat the acronym you mentioned, please?
The acronym, the sequence of engagement.
Did you say HALT-BO?
Oh, HALT-BO. Yeah. So
Yeah.
HALT. And then, so that's what I started with. And then I added B and O. So I do like dash BO. So that's hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, overwhelmed. So it's a nice guidance.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can add, like if somebody's struggling, you can kind of ask questions to try to understand what's happening under it, right? And that happens and that relates to the second stage. And this is good for you too. So when you walk in to work, where are you at? What's your self-awareness? Do you need some time to regulate? Do you need some time to connect, to feel supported before you go teach? I came out of a group once that was really, really challenging. And I went and I just like kind of went off on the supervisor of the perpetrator program. And she could have very easily gone off too, and we would have had a conflict right then, right? But she saw I wasn't doing okay. And instead of that, what she did, and this was before we knew, we're super familiar with Bruce Perry too. This was a long time ago, but she said, Lucy, are you okay? Looks like it was a hard group. Do you want to go take a walk? You know, I can cover you for right now, and then let's connect when you get back. That was the best thing she could have done for me. I felt cared for. I was able to go outside, take a walk around the block. I breathed some fresh air. I got out of my like lower brain. I felt safe. I remembered I was here in the present. Then I came back. She checked in with me. I felt connected, cared for, seen, right? And then we were able to problem solve the issue that came up in group. So this is a gift we can give each other, and we can give ourselves as well. And so last is to really think about when your self-care plan is to think about how are we building resilience. And so it's how are we nurturing all of these different pieces. And this is something to reflect on and think of regularly. The first time I did this activity like this, it was the fall of 2020. And so I filled up all of these buckets and I was feeling really great about myself. But then I realized it was September in Minnesota, and everything I'd written down involved being outside in warm weather, right? That's where I was having fun. That's where I was seeing friends. I was going on runs because the gyms were closed. I was laying in my hammock and reading books for like intellectual. Everything was outside, and I needed to figure out how to adjust it to cold weather. And so it's important to constantly be thinking about, where are my needs? Where do I need to give attention to support myself as a whole being? And so we're not going to do this right now just because of time, but it's something you can also think about in your groups. And there is a template that hits on all of these, as well as financial. How are you taking care of yourself financially? And when you think about environmental and structure, how is that daily structure supporting you in building your resiliency? How are you drawing boundaries, right? How are you creating a high structure, high warmth environment for yourself? So these are also things, as you break off into the reflection, you could talk about as well, because quite often we're usually doing better in one area of nurturing ourselves rather than another area. And this is something very powerful that if you're able to do this at work, too, in an organization, you can really support each other as well. And that is what I have for you today. So thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
If you dropped a question in the chat that hasn't been answered yet, feel free to bring that forward.
Well, if folks don't have questions.
I have a question if it's not too late.
No, go for it.
One thing I struggle with finding balance with in my classroom is all the things you talked about today. And when, say, I have a student, like most of us do, facing deportation or have come from really traumatic experiences, making that shift, like, okay, so anyways, let's talk about adjectives. Like, how do we do that in a mindful, sensitive way? And what should our expectations be for learning when we have really some heavy duty situations in our classrooms?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great question. And I want you to think back, and I know I was talking about this as us as like staff and workers, but it's the same concepts for your students. When you're thinking high structure, high warmth, Maslow, and the sequence of engagement. So one thing in an organization, and this is also good for staff to know, what are the resources? So if a student is coming in and needs something, right? Who can they be connected to? Because you are able to listen to them and then say, you know what? Our social worker, or, this organization we send a lot of people to, and they do great work with our students. So stay after class and I'm going to connect you with them, right? So that takes it off of you as the educator, but they're still feeling those lower levels of Maslow being met. And then thinking about giving time for that sequence of engagement. So it can be built into a lesson plan, having time to ground, having a check-in, to connect, to relate before jumping into reasoning. But then also, if you're noticing the energy shift or something comes up and people are triggered, not powering through, but like pausing and going back through that sequence of engagement. And allowing the flexibility that if something just happened, somebody might not be ready. And so allowing them to learn, allowing them the space, like if you need to get up and get a glass of water or go on a walk or like do what you need to do to take care of yourself, that's okay. And but still maintaining the expectation that learning will happen in the classroom. And so if we take that pause to do the regulate and relate, what happens is that people can then access the cortex. So even if there's like less time specifically on instruction, it's going to be more effective instruction. So you should, in the end, actually see better outcomes because you're helping people get into a space to access their whole brain, right? And it doesn't need to take super long. But there's a lot of really great regulation activities. I know Andrea's doing these trauma-informed groups. I'm sure there'll be a lot of resources in there that you can share with each other. And then also my emails at the end of the slide deck, and I'm always open to brainstorming. I hope that was helpful.
It was, thank you.
Yeah. But just really remember predictability and transparency, right? Students, it helps them to calm and access their whole brain if they know they're going to come in and this is what's going to happen. All right, thanks for the question. I'm sure there'll be a lot of other really wise and brilliant responses in your groups when you can reflect and discuss this. This is my email and contact information. And thank you all for having me. I really hope you enjoy your conference.
Thank you so much, Lucille.